They told you history was written by the winners, but what if that was the biggest lie of all? Tonight, we peel back the pages of time to uncover the hidden authors of history, the ones who erased, rewrote, and reshaped the world's story until even the truth forgot itself. As you listen, you'll begin to notice the cracks between what you were taught and what was never meant to be known. Stay until the end, because the final truth isn't at the beginning of this story. It's buried deep in the silence between the lines. So close your eyes, breathe in. Let's step into the forgotten pages and find out who really wrote history. Have you ever paused to consider how your understanding of history is actually formed? This is not about what you learned in school, but rather who dictated what was worth remembering, what should be overlooked, and who gets to be celebrated as the hero in these narratives. There is an old, albeit cliché, yet profoundly accurate saying, "History is written by the victors." The unsettling aspect is that this is not merely a clever adage. It is a stark reality, an uncomfortable truth that has been reiterated so frequently that it is no longer questioned. Consider this. Following every conflict, every revolution, every period of upheaval, those who emerge triumphant are the ones who narrate the events. Unsurprisingly, they consistently portray themselves as righteous, while their adversaries are depicted as monstrous, even if they were responsible for the most brutal actions. This version of history is then disseminated through educational institutions, textbooks, and documentaries, gradually becoming accepted as objective truth. However, can it truly be considered objective? When do American school textbooks ever portray indigenous peoples as courageous defenders of their ancestral lands? Have you encountered a German textbook that articulates World War II as a wound on the soul of humanity that remains unhealed, or do they simply focus on perpetual apologies? The more significant question is, who determines what narratives are deemed worthy of recounting? Examine museums, often referred to as temples of human memory. Who is immortalized in statues? Whose visages adorn the paintings? And whose existence simply vanishes from the record? It is not coincidental that names like Caesar, Napoleon, and Washington are universally recognized, yet few have heard of Zulu warriors, Maya leaders, or the forgotten female generals of Africa. Why does this disparity exist? Because history is inherently partial. It functions as a potent weapon, capable of instilling shame in an entire populace regarding their ancestors or pride in actions they never committed. This weapon, since ancient times, has consistently been wielded by those who grasp a fundamental principle. Whoever controls the past dictates the present, and whoever controls the present shapes the future. From the earliest statutes in Babylon to the stone carvings of ancient Egypt, from the Enuma Elish to the Hebrew Bible, every civilization has endeavored to mold truth to serve power. Do you believe it was merely a coincidence that pharaohs proclaimed themselves the living embodiment of truth? Certainly not. It was a brilliant strategy, intertwining politics with mythology, ensuring that any challenge to the government was perceived as an affront to the gods themselves. Then came the empires. Rome perfected the art of memory erasure. Slave rebellions were relegated to vague footnotes, conquered cultures, dismissed as uncivilized savages. With the ascent of the Christian Church, memory control entered an entirely new epoch. It transcended mere retelling of the past. It involved a comprehensive rewriting. Gnostic gospels were incinerated, pagan festivals rebranded as Christian holidays, and, notably, the Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of ancient knowledge, was destroyed. Was this an accident, or a deliberate recalibration of humanity's collective memory? Gradually, century by century, history has been edited, distorted, and fragmented. Each instance of this manipulation coincided with a shift in power. However, genuine truth never spontaneously resurfaced. This phenomenon is not confined to antiquity. It is a continuous current, flowing from the distant past to the present moment, a ceaseless stream of manipulation, within which all of us inhabit a version of history selected for us by others. But who are these others who have influenced history without leaving discernible fingerprints? The answer is complex. If you are prepared to delve deeper, we can explore the faint traces they have left behind, spanning from Babylon to the Vatican, from pontiffs to clandestine agents, from Gutenberg's printing press to YouTube's algorithms. History is not static. It is perpetually being narrated by those who understand how to exert control. Perhaps the most disquieting aspect is not what is misrepresented, but what is never spoken of at all. For history, when truly contemplated, encompasses not merely the narratives of the victors, but also an ever-expanding register of forgotten names. Regrettably, that list continues to grow. Have you observed the primary sources from which most of our historical knowledge is derived? These are typically textbooks, museums, and monuments. These purported custodians of memory do not simply store history, they actively select it. Who authors the textbooks? Who decides what content is taught in 6th, 9th, or 12th grade? Who serves on these editorial boards? And who is excluded for being deemed too contentious? In museums, examine their arrangement. Marble statues, war dioramas, national flags, all presented with a silent declaration. These are the elements worthy of remembrance. But by whose decree? Have you ever witnessed a prominent Western museum candidly portraying colonial atrocities? Do any exhibits depict how Belgian soldiers severed the hands of Congolese individuals? Is there a gallery dedicated to the millions who perished from starvation under British rule in India? Returning to textbooks, what do American students learn about the Vietnam War? Is it framed as a conflict against communism, or do they learn about villages scorched by napalm and generations of Vietnamese children deprived of peace? This selective storytelling is not unique to America. Students in other nations also receive incomplete narratives. In Japan, official history books once characterized the invasion of China as a regional stabilization effort. In China, textbooks largely omit mention of the failures of the Cultural Revolution. What these instances share is not outright falsehoods, but a meticulous selection of which truths to convey. This selective narration constitutes the most subtle form of manipulation. There is no need to burn a library to erase someone. Merely neglecting to mention them suffices for their disappearance. Have you heard of Hypatia, the last great philosopher of Alexandria? She was brutally murdered and skinned alive by a mob, with the church turning a blind eye. She once symbolized knowledge, science, and independent thought, yet her name was expunged from official records for nearly a millennium. It was not until the 20th century that the world began to recall her existence. Consider also the African women warriors who led resistance movements against French and Portuguese colonizers. Have their names ever appeared in a history book? Even in Vietnam's own history, have you heard of Le Van Tam, the heroic martyr said to have immolated himself in an act of resistance? Researchers later found no concrete evidence of his existence. The pertinent question, however, is not his reality, but why such a figure needed to be invented. Because history transcends the past, it is the means by which collective memory is constructed, serving as a nation's spiritual map. When this map is inaccurately drawn, entire generations become disoriented. Therefore, never perceive history as a static, completed text. It is not concluded, it is being rewritten daily, in textbooks, museum tours, school lessons, in the statues erected and those dismantled. Most crucially, it is being rewritten by those who possess the authority to determine what is remembered. In this world, the power to select what endures in memory is an invisible, yet perhaps the most absolute, form of power imaginable. Beyond choosing what is told, there is a deeper consideration: who is permitted to tell it? Before the advent of writing, how was history transmitted? Through stories, memory, and oral tradition. This implies that only those who survived were able to continue narrating their experiences. Those who perished lost their voices entirely. Have you contemplated this? A culture could possess millennia of history, yet a single invasion, a plague, or a few decades of forced assimilation could eradicate it. Not because it never existed, but because no one remained to recount it. Thus, the invention of writing was not merely a leap in human progress. It also became the first true instrument for controlling memory. Who were the earliest individuals to acquire writing skills? The priesthood, educated elites, those proximate to power. They were entrusted with documenting what was permissible to remember. The clay tablets from Sumer, the papyrus scrolls of Egypt, the stone carvings of the Hittite Empire. These were not intended for widespread consumption. More significantly, no one else was authorized to revise them. Ancient writing was not designed for the masses. It was a privilege, and that privilege remained vested in a very small group, typically royalty, priests, or the ruling class. Centuries later, the advent of printing, rather than liberating information, ushered in a novel form of control. Gutenberg is often lauded as the progenitor of the information age. However, immediately following the invention of the printing press, both the church and the state swiftly moved to assert control over it. In contemporary Europe, publishing a book necessitated a license. Every printed page required approval. Anything deemed heretical, rebellious, or a threat to public order was prohibited, burned, and sometimes the author suffered the same fate. This form of control was not confined to Europe. In China, woodblock printing was invented early, but its usage was restricted to the emperor, the court, and the scholar elite, not common people, nor those whose narratives diverged from official history. Globally, tools for writing and recording were not developed to empower everyone. They were created to safeguard the power of a select few. Language followed a similar pattern. In India, Sanskrit was once a sacred language, but only Brahmins were permitted to study it. In Europe, for centuries, the Bible was exclusively in Latin, meaning ordinary individuals could not read it themselves. They had to rely on official interpretations. Therefore, even if you possessed a story to tell, you lacked the linguistic means to convey it in a manner that would be heard. Now, envision hundreds of civilizations from Africa, pre-Columbian America, and ancient Australia, each with their distinct histories, myths, and memories, but lacking writing systems, printing presses, or official documents to preserve those memories. A single conquest, one wave of assimilation, and it all vanishes without a trace. Writing, printing, and language are not neutral tools. They are filters. The true power lies not in who tells the story, but in who controls the filter. Today, we read books, consult Wikipedia, search Google, listen to podcasts, and experience a sense of boundless informational freedom. In reality, we are still consuming content that has been digitized, curated, and validated as reliable. The unsettling truth is that an entire culture need not be destroyed by fire. It merely requires no one to reprint it or translate it into a prominent language for it to disappear. Tracing history back to the world's earliest civilizations, to the dawn of writing and law, reveals a clear pattern. History was never intended as a neutral record of the past. From its very inception, it was a tool, a weapon wielded to maintain power. Consider Babylon. When Mesopotamia is discussed, the grand cities, the rivers, and of course the Code of Hammurabi, one of humanity's earliest written legal codes, are typically mentioned. What is often overlooked, however, is that it was not merely law, it was a historical declaration. Examine the opening lines of that code, not the rules and punishments, but where Hammurabi states, "I, Hammurabi, chosen by the gods, bring justice to the world." Does this sound familiar? It is the classic formula, legitimizing political power through divine authority. This law was inscribed in stone, not for everyday citizens to read, but to proclaim to the heavens. This law is not man-made. It originates from the gods, conveyed through the king. If the law emanates from the gods, who would dare to question, alter, or challenge it? This was not merely a legal document. It was one of the earliest examples of official history, where an individual defines what is right, records it, and positions himself as the narrative's hero. From that point forward, a clear principle emerged. In ancient civilizations, history was not separate from politics. History was politics. This becomes even more apparent in ancient Egypt. There, pharaohs were not merely monarchs, they were considered living deities. They embodied truth. The highest symbol of this order was Ma'at, the goddess of truth, harmony, and justice. However, Ma'at did not represent truth as we understand it today, in terms of scientific objectivity. Ma'at was a sacred order, an ideology defined by the pharaoh himself. The pharaoh ruled not only with armies but with narratives, with a version of history framed as mythology. Military victories were carved into temple walls. Every battle concluded in triumph. When nature unleashed its fury, it was depicted as the universe testing the pharaoh's greatness. Do you perceive the pattern here? When the ruler controls the entire narrative, any failure can be recategorized as fate, a divine trial, or, more conveniently, simply erased from the stone record. This was not a phenomenon confined to antiquity. This model of utilizing divine power to legitimize history was replicated universally, from ancient China's mandate of heaven to medieval Europe's divine right of kings, and to modern regimes that declare their leaders the light of the nation. However, the genesis of it all began in Babylon and Egypt, where writing, law, and religion were fused into a single, potent storytelling apparatus. For the first time, history was not the collective voice of a community, but the solitary voice of a king, etched into stone, designed for eternity. When a story endures long enough, people cease questioning it and begin to accept it as truth. Yet, there is something even more subtle than law or divine titles. It is when power does not merely employ history to justify itself, but constructs an entire worldview to persuade people that, without that power, the universe would descend into chaos. This is precisely what the Babylonians achieved with the Enuma Elish, their ancient creation myth inscribed on 7 clay tablets. At first glance, it appears to be another mythological tale, but upon closer inspection, it reveals itself as the unspoken constitution of the world's first centralized state. The narrative commences in chaos, fresh and salt water intermingling, ancient gods clashing, conflict erupting. A new generation of gods rises against the old. Violence proliferates, and then one god steps forth, Marduk. What is fascinating is that Marduk was not the eldest god, nor the strongest, nor the original creator, but he presented an offer. If I triumph in this war, I will restore order, but in return, I will become the supreme god forever. Consequently, Marduk slays Tiamat, the goddess of chaos. He cleaves her body in two to form the heavens and the earth. Then, using the blood of a rebel god, he creates humankind to serve the gods. This may sound like a wild myth, but now, try substituting a few keywords. Marduk becomes the new king. Tiamat represents the old regime, the symbol of disorder. Victory signifies political reform. The new order is a centralized ruling system, and humans are the tools created to serve that system. The Enuma Elish is not merely a myth, it is a victory speech, a declaration by a ruling dynasty articulated in cosmic language. The fact that it was recited annually at the Babylonian New Year festival, before the populace and officials, makes it one of the earliest known forms of state propaganda. Each year, citizens heard the same narrative. Each year, they were reminded that the current order was not merely logical, but sacred. Each year, they were warned that without Marduk, the world would relapse into chaos, akin to Tiamat, dark, terrifying, uncontrollable. Do you see what is occurring here? History, in this context, is not about the past. It is a tool to secure the present and shape the future. From this moment, a powerful idea was born. History possesses a purpose. It is no longer merely the shared memory of a community. It is no longer oral tradition. It is a carefully constructed narrative with a message, an outcome, and one clear objective: to legitimize whoever is currently in power. Since the Enuma Elish, countless epic traditions have followed the same blueprint. In India, the Mahabharata recounts a massive war between two royal lineages, but its central theme consistently revolves around preserving Dharma, the sacred order. In China, Sima Qian's historical records were not just chronicles, they were didactic texts intended to guide and admonish future emperors. In Europe, the Hebrew Bible reinterpreted earlier folk stories into a national history, one that provided divine justification for an emerging people, even when much of it conflicted with archaeological findings. All of this emanates from one subtle yet potent idea: the narrative we construct about the past determines who governs in the present. This is why, from very early on, those in power were not merely concerned with who wielded the sword. Even more crucial was who held the pen. If the Enuma Elish served as the inaugural myth to legitimize power, then the Hebrew Bible perhaps stands as the most emblematic instance of rewriting history, not merely to document a past, but to forge a people. This is the juncture where history ceased being who we are and became who we were chosen to be. It did not merely recount events, it constructed a purpose, a rationale for existence, for migration, for conflict, for claiming a land, and for believing this claim to be a divine right granted by God. You are likely familiar with the narrative. The patriarch Abraham is promised a land flowing with milk and honey. Subsequently, the Jewish people are enslaved in Egypt. Moses leads them out. They wander the desert for 40 years, eventually reaching the promised land, Canaan. This sounds epic. However, here lies the challenge. Modern archaeologists, including Israeli scholar Israel Finkelstein, have found no unequivocal evidence for the Exodus. There are no indications of a mass migration, no archaeological proof of the type of conquest over Canaan described in the Bible. Furthermore, the supposed ancient Israelites appear to have been part of the local population, not migrants from the Sinai desert. What does this imply? It signifies that the Hebrew Bible is not a neutral, factual record of events. It is a national declaration, a potent narrative meticulously crafted by a group of people forging their identity. They authored a glorious origin story, a chosen people, oppressed, and then delivered by divine mission. This is not uncommon. Almost every nation, at some point, rewrites its history to define itself. However, the Bible goes further. It expunges what does not conform. Old Canaanite myths are erased. Local gods are branded as false idols. Neighboring tribes are depicted as wicked, sinful, and deserving of destruction. In the book of Joshua, entire cities like Jericho and Ai are annihilated, not as acts of war, but as divine purification, not conquest, but the fulfillment of God's sacred promise. Do you observe what is happening here? History is no longer merely "this is what we did." It transforms into "we were permitted to do it because God chose us." Once you invoke God's name, any action can be justified, from annihilating civilizations to completely redrawing the map of memory. It is not coincidental that the Hebrew Bible became the bedrock for the three major Abrahamic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Nor is it coincidental that some of the bloodiest conflicts in human history have stemmed from the contention over who possesses the truth within the Holy Book. Of course, this does not negate the spiritual, moral, or cultural value of religion. However, what must be recognized is this: the history contained within the Bible is not neutral history. It is purposeful history, a blueprint for national identity, for divine mission, and for authority over contested lands. This model of rewriting memory to construct power would subsequently be adopted by empires globally and extended even further with new technologies. History would be compiled, edited, censored, then published as official, but its genesis lies precisely here, in sacred pages, where the act of rewriting memory was also the act of constructing power. If the Hebrew Bible marked the inception of purpose-driven history, then ancient Rome represented the moment when the official history apparatus reached its zenith. This began with something that appears perfectly reasonable: state historians. The Roman Empire understood a crucial principle: to govern a vast territory inhabited by hundreds of ethnicities, languages, and religions. A common historical narrative was essential, a story everyone could accept, reiterate, and be taught. Thus, they established the role of historiographus, the official state historian. Their mandate was not to pursue truth, but to curate the empire's memory. They documented the emperor's victories, portrayed every rebellion as treason, meaningless chaos to be quelled. Defeats simply never occurred, at least not officially. Consider Spartacus, the slave leader who profoundly challenged the Roman system. How is he remembered in official Roman history? He receives barely a mention, a few brief, contemptuous lines, and then nothing. Conversely, Caesar's campaigns and Augustus's victories read like epic poems, with entire volumes dedicated to their glorification. Roman history became a form of theater. Each reign was a scripted drama, every emperor the principal actor, and the populace, whether living, deceased, resistant, or obedient, merely part of the backdrop. Anyone who did not conform to the narrative was erased, sometimes quite literally. Have you heard of damnatio memoriae? This was Rome's ultimate punishment, not to kill a person, but to eradicate their memory. Their name would be chiseled from stone, their statues destroyed, books mentioning them burned, and public utterance of their name forbidden. In essence, if Rome disapproved of you, you might as well have never existed. Should someone centuries later stumble upon a trace of you, you would be nothing more than a shadow, a historical enigma, with no surviving evidence to restore your identity. This transcended mere historical revision. It was memory engineering, deliberate, organized, and systematic. The most astonishing aspect is that the Romans did not conceal this. They never asserted that history was about truth. They only cared that it served stability. Truth was less important than obedience. Accuracy was secondary to maintaining order. Objectivity was irrelevant. It simply had to convince people that Rome was eternal. This is why Roman inscriptions always sounded so grand, so definitive. Augustus, son of the divine, who brought peace to the world through his victory. But peace for whom? Precisely? For Roman citizens, perhaps. But what about the erased tribes, the vanquished peoples, the untold stories? What they received was not peace, but silence, a peace born of fear and the control of memory. In Rome, history was no longer mere storytelling. It became a political weapon. If you controlled it, you did not require more soldiers. You did not need to kill. You simply needed people to forget. This model, this machinery of memory control, would soon be inherited by a new force, more religious, more powerful, and even more adept at not only controlling the past, but shaping the future. As the Roman Empire began its decline, that power, the power to control history, memory, symbols, and even silence, did not vanish. It transitioned, not to a nation or an emperor, but to something more elusive, more sacred, and far more enduring: the Christian Church. Consider this. When most empires fall, their historical narratives typically crumble with them. However, in Europe, people did not dismantle Rome's memory machine. They sanctified it. Instead of the emperor is the son of a god, it became the Pope is the representative of God on earth. Instead of military victories carved in stone, there were divine commandments inscribed in scripture, proclaimed from pulpits, and crucially, never translated into the vernacular of the common people. Have you ever noticed that for nearly a millennium, the Bible was written exclusively in Latin, a language understood only by clergy, scholars, and nobility? This meant ordinary people could never read the Word of God in their own tongue. They could only hear it recounted and reinterpreted in the manner the Church permitted. During this entire era, it was not merely the narrative of God that was safeguarded. It was the entirety of humanity's memory. Have you heard of the Gnostic Gospels? These were ancient texts, potentially even older than some of the official New Testament writings, offering a radically different interpretation of Jesus' teachings, less focused on dogma and punishment, more spiritual, personal, and human. However, the Church declared them heresy. They were burned, forbidden from being copied, and excised from official history. And what about the ancient pagan festivals, celebrations of the sun, harvest gods, and fertility goddesses? They were not obliterated, they were renamed. The birthday of the sun god became Christmas. The spring festival of earth goddesses became Easter. Just like that, older cultures were not erased, they were rebranded, sanitized, and sanctioned. Perhaps the greatest loss of all was the Library of Alexandria, a monumental archive of knowledge, housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and India. To this day, there is no consensus on precisely who destroyed it, or when, or why. However, one fact is undeniable. Over centuries, the Church made no genuine effort to preserve knowledge outside of Christian doctrine. Any text that did not align with Church teachings, if not burned, was prohibited from being copied, circulated, or translated. And you understand what that implies. A book that is not read might as well have never existed. The Church did not merely control the present through faith. It controlled the past by determining what could be called truth and deciding who was permitted to read it. This model persisted for centuries, leaving a profound impact. All of Europe experienced what could be termed intentional illiteracy, not because people were incapable of reading, but because they were denied access to any knowledge beyond what the Church sanctioned. Therefore, when one reflects from Babylon to Egypt, to the Enuma Elish, to the Bible, to Rome, to the Church, one truth becomes abundantly clear. History, from its origins to the Middle Ages, was never a natural flow. It was a meticulously filtered sequence, rewritten, reinterpreted, whitewashed, legalized, and ultimately canonized. And it did not cease there, because even with the advent of printing, the so-called revolution of knowledge, the same question persisted. Who is allowed to print? Who grants approval? Who is banned? And who determines what constitutes truth? If there is one symbol that encapsulates everything history has attempted to erase, it is the Library of Alexandria. We often speak of it as a tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls burned, ancient knowledge obliterated, humanity losing an irreplaceable fragment of its past. Yet, very few people pause to ask who truly burned it, and more significantly, why. Numerous legends exist, some attribute it to Julius Caesar, others blame Bishop Theophilus and a Christian mob. Some theories point to later Islamic conquests. However, if we disregard the names, one truth endures. Whoever held power at the time did not prioritize the preservation of knowledge. Because the Library of Alexandria was no ordinary library. It was a multidimensional map of the past, where Egyptian mythology, Greek philosophy, Babylonian astronomy, Indian medicine, and Persian mathematics all coexisted in dozens of languages. It contained alternative versions of the world, unfiltered by dogma, unapproved by royal decree, uncensored, untamed, unaligned, and that made it dangerous. Consider this. If an empire, whether political or religious, seeks to enforce its official version of history, what poses the greatest threat? Not an army, but a place brimming with uncontrolled memory stories that deviate from the script, truths that have no place in Scripture. The Library of Alexandria was precisely that place. So, whoever burned it, it was not an accident. It was a clear act within a pattern that has recurred for millennia. If knowledge cannot be controlled, destroying it is perceived as safer. The consequences are immeasurable. Some estimate that over 90% of all ancient writings have been lost forever. We no longer precisely understand what the ancient Egyptians knew about the human body. We cannot fully comprehend how Babylonian astronomers charted the stars. The original texts of countless pre-Socratic philosophers are gone, and, even more unsettling, we no longer know what we once knew. That is the truly terrifying aspect, not the fire itself, but the silent disappearance of memory. When memory vanishes, history is rewritten. And when history is rewritten, someone decides what is worth remembering and what will be permanently erased. You now perceive it, do you not? From ancient kings to Roman emperors to the medieval church, and now to modern information systems, history has consistently been reshaped by invisible forces. The burning of the Library of Alexandria was neither the beginning nor the end, but a climax in a quiet, ongoing current. The more knowledge is lost, the easier it becomes to fabricate a new truth. After libraries were burned and ancient scrolls erased, human knowledge was no longer annihilated with swords or flames. It entered a new phase. It was sequestered in languages incomprehensible to common people. We refer to that era as the Middle Ages. But for knowledge, it was an age of linguistic imprisonment, especially concerning the Bible, the most sacred and influential book in the Western world, and for centuries, the most rigorously controlled. Have you ever questioned why the Bible was written and read exclusively in Latin for 1,000 years? It was not because Latin was holier than other languages, nor certainly because God spoke only Latin. The answer is straightforward. Latin was a language the average person could not comprehend. And if you cannot read a book, you are compelled to trust whoever reads it for you. This is how the medieval church established an intellectual monopoly, unlike any other in history, not merely control over knowledge, but control over access to knowledge. Not banning books, but rendering them unreadable. Not incinerating texts, but writing them in a language only they could interpret. From this foundation, the right to interpret evolved into a form of power. Priests were not merely literate men, they were the translators of truth. If you dared to challenge their version, you possessed no proof. You could not read the original. All you had was faith, and they were the gatekeepers of that faith. This is why anyone who attempted to translate the Bible into local languages, German, English, French, was branded a heretic, hunted down, and even burned alive. Recall William Tyndale, an English scholar in the early 1500s. He was the first to translate the entire Bible into English directly from Hebrew and ancient Greek, rather than from the Latin Vulgate. He espoused a radical yet beautifully simple idea. Even the plowboy in the field deserves to read the Word of God. For this conviction, he was arrested, strangled, and burned at the stake. This appears contradictory, does it not? A religion that preaches love and truth, killing a man simply for helping others understand the truth. However, it is not a contradiction at all when history is viewed through the lens of power. In the medieval world, language was not merely communication, it was a social barrier. If you knew Latin, you were elevated. If you did not, you were subordinate. History, which should have belonged to everyone, became the private property of the few who could read, and read in the sanctioned language. This applied not just to the Bible, but to everything: science, medicine, philosophy. These were copied by hand in monasteries in Latin. No one outside the clergy could touch them, teach them, or consequently, control humanity's memory. Thus, the world was no longer governed by weapons, but by ideas. People did not rebel, not because they were ignorant, but because they lacked the vocabulary to articulate their oppression. Once you cannot name what you feel, you cannot combat it. Therefore, when language was restricted, when the Bible was monopolized, when books existed solely in the possession of priests, those who dared to narrate the story differently began to be perceived as dangerous. Not criminals or murderers, but simply historians, philosophers, scientists, poets, individuals who merely did not adhere to approved narratives. Consider what it takes for someone to be burned alive. Could it truly be just for writing a book? In the Middle Ages, the answer was yes. A single sentence, an idea that contravened doctrine, a suggestion that the earth revolved around the sun, or, worse, that humans might comprehend history independently without requiring religious authorities' approval, that was sufficient to label you a heretic, to have you hunted, tried, and executed. Not by sword, but by fire. Why fire? They claimed it purified the soul, but in truth, it obliterated memory. When a person was burned, their books were burned, and what they knew perished with them. One of the most haunting cases was Giordano Bruno. Bruno was not merely a philosopher. He was one of modern Europe's earliest free thinkers. He believed the universe was infinite, that there could be countless worlds, suns, and forms of life. He questioned the concept of a closed cosmos, where everything revolved around Earth, where humanity was the center of all things, where there was only one version of truth. Bruno was not a scientist in the modern sense. He was a visionary, a storyteller, someone who posed questions that power sought to suppress. For this, in the year 1600, he was arrested by the church, tried, and ordered to recant. Bruno refused. They burned him alive in Campo de' Fiori in Rome. The irony? Bruno did not die because he was anti-science. He died because he was too far ahead of his time, because he trespassed upon the one taboo no authority could tolerate, that history is not fixed, that it is a story, and that everyone has the right to tell it in their own way. Do you understand now? When power feels threatened, it does not need to prove you wrong. It only needs to silence you. And if you will not be silenced, it will ensure the world cannot hear you. This is how so many versions of history vanished, not because they lacked value, but because they lacked permission to exist. No one copied them, no one read them, no one taught them. We now term this a lack of historical sources, but in reality, someone deliberately ensured their erasure. You are beginning to perceive, are you not? History is not distorted with blatant lies. It is subtly bent through silence by burning a single person, by instilling fear in others, by fostering the belief that there is only one correct way to remember the past. And if you remember it differently, something must be wrong with you. This is not merely control over words, it is control over minds. And it did not conclude with Bruno. Other truth-tellers, the Cathars, the Templars, the Rosicrucians, were also eradicated, not because they lacked ideals, but because their ideals did not align with the official history being constructed. If Bruno's death demonstrated that narrating the wrong version of official history could lead to your erasure, then the Crusades proved the opposite. If you write the approved version of history, you can kill without ever needing to apologize. Because you are no longer killing, you are liberating the Holy Land. You are not invading, you are defending the faith. You are not committing massacres, you are fulfilling a divine mission from God. And that, it is believed, is sufficient. No justification needed, no truth required. The Crusades, particularly the First Crusade in 1096, are often depicted in Western history books as a noble armed pilgrimage intended to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim infidels. Following this call, tens of thousands of nobles, peasants, even criminals who were pardoned if they joined, took up the cross, drew their swords, and marched eastward. However, beneath the term liberation lay a wave of atrocities that many Western histories spent centuries sidestepping. In Jerusalem, when Crusaders entered the city in 1099, a contemporary chronicler, Raymond of Aguilers, who was present, described the scene. Blood reached the ankles of our horses in the Temple of Solomon. Jews were burned alive inside their synagogues. Muslims were slaughtered inside their mosques. No distinction was made between soldier or civilian. There were no trials, no mercy. Yet, in official records that followed, this was portrayed as a victory of faith, a just response to centuries of oppression, a sacred act to restore truth. Does this sound familiar? Initiate the action, then write the story later. And when the one wielding the sword also holds the pen, the final version of the story will not reek of blood. It will carry the scent of divine destiny. Consider how history was subsequently recorded. The Northern Crusades were termed campaigns to spread the light of Christianity. The extermination of pagan peoples in the Baltics was characterized as civilizing the frontier. The sack of Constantinople in 1204, a Christian city, was dismissed as a regrettable incident, and those who did not adhere to the official line, like the Cathars, a Christian movement in southern France, were declared heretics. The result was the Albigensian Crusade, the first instance of Christians launching a crusade against fellow Christians in the name of God. A quote often attributed to the Crusader commander at the time. Kill them all. God will know his own. Chilling, is it not? Once again, history did not safeguard truth. It safeguarded power. It did not inquire who was right. It sided with who had the right to write. This compels us to ask, how many wars have been masked by the word liberation? How many killers were transformed into heroes simply because they fought under the correct banner? The Crusades reveal a harsh truth. When history is written by those who wield the sword and don the holy robes, truth will wear a cloak, but it will still drip with blood. However, not everyone remained silent. Not everyone submitted to the official flow of history. In the obscure crevices of the Middle Ages, when everything was stringently controlled, when every word required approval, when even prayer was restricted to Latin, there were still individuals who kept another kind of memory alive. They did not contend with swords. They did not preach from pulpits. They operated in silence. They transmitted knowledge through symbols. They preserved the fragments that had been excised from the official narrative. And because of this, they became targets. We know them by names such as the Templars, the Cathars, the Rosicrucians, and others lost to the annals of time. Their common thread was their existence outside official history, and consequently, their eventual removal from it. Let us begin with the Cathars, a spiritual movement that flourished in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries. They believed in purity. They rejected materialism. They did not worship power. They did not recognize the Roman Church as the sole voice of God. Most notably, they did not believe that God could ever command someone to kill. To them, evil could not emanate from heaven. Harmless, it seems, right? Yet, Pope Innocent III declared them a threat and launched the Albigensian Crusade to annihilate them. The city of Béziers was razed to the ground. Tens of thousands were killed, Cathar or not. No distinction, no trial, no mercy. From that moment, the Cathars vanished from history not because they were wrong, but because they told the wrong story, the one that was forbidden. Then came the Knights Templar, one of the most powerful and enigmatic forces of the medieval world. They fought in the Crusades. They were sanctioned by the Pope. They owned land across Europe. More importantly, they developed their own system of knowledge. They were not merely warriors. They operated banking networks, utilized encryption, possessed secret symbols, and safeguarded documents no one else had ever seen. However, over time, they became too wealthy, too independent, too difficult to control. In a world where only one official narrative is tolerated, anyone with an autonomous voice must be silenced. In 1307, under pressure from King Philip IV of France, and with the assent of Pope Clement V, the entire Templar order was arrested in a single night. They were tortured, coerced into confessing heresy, burned at the stake, their assets seized, their records destroyed, their memories suppressed and forbidden. In official history, they were labeled as lost souls or fallen knights. But the truth is, they were guardians of a parallel stream of knowledge, erased before they could complete their part of the story. Finally, the Rosicrucians, the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, a mysterious group that emerged in early 17th century Europe, issuing manifestos that advocated for intellectual awakening and the fusion of science, spirituality, and philosophy. They did not establish a church. They did not seek power. They simply declared that human history was not merely the rise and fall of empires, but a profound inner journey, a quest for truth beyond dogma. Immediately, they were assailed from both sides. The church branded them heretics. Rulers feared they were disseminating free thought. The outcome, their name was relegated to the shadows. They were mystified, as if they had never truly existed, transformed into myth. Just like that, history no longer needed to burn them. It merely had to transform them into a legend, because when something is deemed too mysterious, people cease asking questions. And once questions cease, that memory dies the quietest death of all, by being deemed unimportant. The 13th of October 1307, a Friday morning, nearly every significant leader of the Knights Templar was arrested simultaneously across France. No war, no rebellion, just a royal decree, a quiet assent from the Pope, and a pre-prepared list of names. We often refer to it as a purge, but in reality, it was more akin to a memory execution, precise, efficient, leaving no trace. The question is, why? The Templars had once been heroes of the Crusades. They were granted privileges by the Pope himself, exempt from secular laws. They managed banks, protected pilgrims, and established networks across Europe. They did not betray anyone. They did not rebel. They did not openly defy. However, they possessed one thing that power could never tolerate. They existed outside of control. The Templars had wealth. They possessed their own knowledge, symbols, and libraries. They were connected to political forces and ancient knowledge circles. Worse still, they held their own memory, a parallel version of history distinct from the official narrative. King Philip IV of France owed the Templars a substantial debt. Pope Clement V was under political pressure from the French crown, and the Church had begun to perceive the Templars not as loyal instruments, but as a growing threat. And so, history began to be rewritten. The Templars were accused of heresy, of demon worship, of performing perverse rituals. No genuine evidence, only confessions extracted under torture. Their assets were seized, their members burned, their name expunged from official documents. The last Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was burned alive in Paris. But before he died, he reportedly looked directly at the Pope and the King and declared, "Within 1 year, both of you will appear before God's court to answer for this crime." And as the story goes, within a year, both Philip IV and Clement V were dead. It sounds like a legend, but the very fact that it became legend is telling. The Templars were not remembered as a major cultural and political force. They were reduced to myth, mystery, conspiracy theories, and whispers. Because the easiest way to undermine a story is not to disprove it, but to relegate it from the serious stage, transforming it into a midnight tale. Ever since, many people believe the Templars were merely knights. They forget that they once managed banking systems, designed architecture, employed encryption, built networks of power, and potentially safeguarded an entire forbidden lineage of knowledge. The Purge of 1307 was not merely a political event. It was a locked door, sealing off a vast archive of memory that was never allowed to be recognized. No one dared to recount the Templars' story again. And as is always the case in history, when no one dares to speak, it signifies that the victors have concluded writing the final chapter. People often refer to the Renaissance as a golden age, a great awakening after the protracted obscurity of the Middle Ages, the moment humanity rediscovered reason, art, science, and ancient philosophy. It was the era of Leonardo, Michelangelo, Galileo, a time when lost knowledge was supposedly restored. This narrative sounds hopeful, even heroic. Yet, upon closer examination, a significant question is quietly omitted. Who was permitted to restore the past? And what precisely were they restoring? Because the Renaissance was not about unearthing every historical artifact. It was a selective recovery, a curated revival. And just like every other era, those who possess the power to choose also possess the power to erase. The Renaissance did not embrace everyone. Ancient Greek and Roman texts were sought out, translated, and celebrated, but knowledge from India, Persia, the Islamic world, and Africa was frequently dismissed as foreign, mystical, or incompatible with Europe's enlightened spirit. Some of it was mistranslated, some silenced, some had its content appropriated while its source was erased. Similarly, certain philosophers like Plato and Aristotle were revived, but alternative schools of thought such as mysticism, pre-Christian traditions, or suppressed religions like Gnosticism and Kabbalah were treated as esoteric footnotes, never granted center stage. Do you see where this is heading? The Renaissance was not merely a rebirth, it was a reconstruction of memory filtered through the lens of the present. What does this mean? It means that only the fragments of the past that aligned with the emerging worldview were resurrected. The rest remained buried. Even in this supposed age of enlightenment, for example, Arabic advancements in mathematics were studied and adopted, but often credited as European developments. Persian medical texts were translated, but the translators received more acclaim than the original authors. Even ancient maps recovered from Middle Eastern manuscripts were republished in Western books with their original sources removed, rebranded as examples of European exploration. And what about those who had protected forbidden memories during the Middle Ages, descendants of the Templars, the Cathars, or indigenous wisdom traditions? They were not invited into the Renaissance. They remained outsiders, their knowledge still labeled as mystical, irrational, and anti-progress. So, here is the fundamental question. Was the Renaissance truly a revival, or was it a rewriting of history? Because when you only illuminate the fragments of memory that fit your narrative, everything else remains in darkness. Or worse, it is labeled unworthy of retrieval. Thus, while Galileo directed his telescope toward the heavens and Leonardo meticulously mapped the human body, most people of that era still existed in a world where knowledge that did not serve the prevailing power structure was deemed irrelevant or even perilous. You perceive it now, do you not? The medieval curtain may have been raised, but the stage still belonged to a select few, while countless other scripts remained concealed backstage. Then, amidst the Renaissance wave, came one of the most revolutionary inventions in the history of knowledge: Gutenberg's printing press. For the first time, the written word was no longer confined within monasteries. For the first time, books were not merely treasures of the elite. For the first time, information could be copied rapidly and disseminated widely across borders, across generations. It felt like an Enlightenment dream, and indeed, in many respects, it was a revolution. However, a deeper examination reveals something critical. The printing revolution did not automatically bring freedom. It merely shifted who held the power. Prior to this, the church and monastic scribes controlled the flow of knowledge, copying by hand in shadows on expensive parchment. Now, the printing press could endlessly reproduce books. But the crucial questions were: what was printed? Who was allowed to print it? Who was authorized to distribute it? And most importantly, who controlled the content? Because the danger of everyone being able to print anything was patently obvious to those in authority. By the late 15th century, kingdoms and churches moved swiftly to regulate the new technology. In France, Germany, and Spain, every printing press required a license. All books had to be approved before publication. Anything deemed divisive, heretical, or destabilizing was banned, seized, and destroyed. Sometimes printers were fined, sometimes they were executed. Did you know that one of the first actions of the Inquisition after the invention of the press was to create a list of forbidden books? It was called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Prohibited Books. And it was no brief list. It expanded over centuries, banning thousands of titles, from Greek philosophy to non-Latin Bible translations to scientific, medical, and political texts. Even Bible editions in native languages, like Luther's German version or Tyndale's English one, were banned or burned en masse. What does this indicate? It indicates that knowledge was not truly liberated. It was simply replicated faster under the surveillance of those holding the censorship keys. Consider that when a book was banned during the manuscript era, perhaps only one copy might be burned. But in the age of print, hundreds or thousands of copies could be burned at once, and with them, any chance for an alternative viewpoint to survive. In fact, there were periods when print shops were so stringently controlled that they became propaganda machines. Governments ordered the content, churches vetted the manuscripts. If it disrupted the official order, it was not printed. If it reinforced the dominant faith, it was printed by the thousands and distributed for free. You perceive it now, do you not? Technology itself does not liberate people. Whoever controls the technology determines whom it serves. The printing press was not the problem, but in the hands of the powerful, it became a tool to reinforce authority, not to dismantle it. And so, instead of the dream that everyone would access truth, we received something else. Truth was still trimmed, packaged, and chosen only now at high speed. When Europe embarked on the age of exploration, as ships traversed oceans, crossed the Atlantic, and reached Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they brought not only weapons, gunpowder, and gold. They brought something else, their own narrative. And they utilized that narrative to overwrite the histories of the lands they encountered, lands whose stories had, until then, never been written by them. And so, history entered a new phase. Colonial history, where the past of a people was supplanted by the myth of discovery, recounted by the conqueror. The Americas were no longer the home of millions of indigenous people with their own civilizations, languages, and religions. They became the New World, as if no one had ever inhabited them before. The grand temples of the Inca, Maya, and Aztec were no longer centers of knowledge. They were labeled savage sites in need of salvation by gun and God. Did you know that when Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico, the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan possessed advanced canals, urban planning, marketplaces, and public sanitation far surpassing many European cities of the time? But after conquest, the entire city was destroyed, and native history was rewritten into the myth of Spanish civilization saving the primitive natives. The same narrative unfolded in Africa. Empires like Mali, Songhai, and Great Zimbabwe had libraries, trade systems, and legal codes. But when colonizers arrived, they termed Africa, the dark continent, backward, illiterate, in need of Western enlightenment. You see it now. History was not erased. It was rewritten from a singular point of view, and it did not stop at words. European museums filled with stolen artifacts, sacred masks, ancestral statues, mummies, even human skulls. But when displayed, they were not labeled loot from colonies. They were labeled evidence of early human evolution, implying that the conquered peoples represented a primitive stage in human development. Even languages, names, beliefs, and folklore were dismissed as superstition, inferior culture, and anti-progress. Then came education. Indian children were taught British history, Algerian children, French history, Filipino children, American history. Not their own history, but the history of those who arrived, who stole, and then taught them the noble reasons for doing so. And when you are raised within that system, you begin to believe, my people needed to be civilized. I am fortunate we were colonized. My ancestors were savages. That is when history ceases to be a tool for remembering and becomes a tool for making you forget. Forget who you are. Forget that your civilization once stood as an equal. Forget that entire systems of knowledge existed outside the Western model, outside formal science, outside God. And the most devastating aspect is when you begin to feel ashamed of your ancestors' memory. If the colonial era was when history was rewritten by the strong over the weak, then the world wars marked a time when history was rewritten by the winners over the losers. But this time, it was not done with swords or missionaries. It was done with cameras, newspapers, textbooks, international conferences, and global propaganda campaign. World Wars I and II, the most massive and destructive conflicts in modern history, killed tens of millions, redrew borders, and reshuffled the global balance of power. And once the smoke cleared, history was rewritten not with truth, but with approved truth. Let us begin with a simple reality. After World War II, the narrative was explicitly defined. There were villains and there were heroes. Fascism was the enemy of humanity. The Allies were the saviors of the world. This narrative is not entirely false, but it is far from complete. A significant portion of Nazi documentation was selectively destroyed after the war. Many Nazi generals, scientists, and engineers were secretly recruited by both the United States and the Soviet Union in operations like Paperclip. Their pasts were expunged, their names cleansed, and their contributions reframed. One worked on rockets for NASA, another developed weapons for the USSR. Official histories rarely mention their ties to concentration camps, because once you serve the victor, your past can be rewritten. Similarly, atrocities committed by the Allies, such as dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the firebombing of German cities that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, were labeled necessary and unavoidable, or the only way to end the war. But ask yourself this: if the Axis powers had used atomic bombs first, would the historical narrative be so forgiving? You now recognize the pattern, do you not? When the victors write history, they do not need to justify everything, they simply need to make it sound reasonable. And if something cannot be justified, they simply do not discuss it. The official history of the world wars, the one we learn in textbooks, is a heavily edited script. It emphasizes the crimes of the defeated. It downplays the transgressions of the victors. And most notably, it eradicates the voices that were never permitted to speak. Japanese survivors of the atomic bomb, no dedicated chapter. German civilians killed in Allied air raids, barely a footnote. Writers, philosophers, and historians from the losing side, branded dangerous, excluded from the narrative. Even today, if someone questions the accepted remembrance of the war, they are swiftly labeled a revisionist or, worse, accused of sympathizing with the wrong side. What does this tell you? It tells you that war history is no longer about memory. It is about framing a constructed narrative, edited, scripted, and reiterated until everyone knows the lines by heart. And in that story, the losers do not get to tell theirs because they lack printing presses. They do not own the media. They do not get to host global conferences. They do not write the textbooks. All they retain is memory, and memory, alas, is not cited in official records. After World War II, the world did not enter a period of peace, at least not the kind people had hoped for. It transitioned into a protracted, subtle conflict, a war where bombs were merely the surface manifestation. The true battleground was memory. The Cold War, was not solely a clash between the US and the Soviet Union. It was a war over who defined the world, who was free and who was oppressive, who championed justice and who embodied evil, who represented the future and who obstructed progress. Each side possessed its own version of history. In the US, children were taught that communism posed the greatest threat to humanity. In the Soviet Union, children were taught that capitalism was a system of exploitation and global suffering. History textbooks, films, propaganda posters, and school lessons were all meticulously crafted to support a singular worldview, and crucially, to convince people that we are the good guys. Did you know that during this era, both the US and the Soviet Union maintained special agencies not merely for espionage or sabotage, but to write and erase history? In the US, there was the CIA and groups like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which secretly funded artists, writers, journalists, and scholars in Europe to promote a version of free culture that counteracted Soviet influence. They financed publications, guided research, and even shaped public discourse, often without ever disclosing who controlled the operations. Many intellectuals in post-war Europe who authored critiques of communism believed they were acting independently, but in truth, they were often indirectly supported by American intelligence. In the Soviet Union, a similar strategy was employed. They had state-run entities, censorship bureaus, and official publishing houses. The history of the Russian Revolution, Lenin, Stalin, and Soviet satellite states was edited and re-edited to align with the politics of the moment. If someone who was once celebrated fell out of favor, their name was expunged from books, their face removed from group photographs. Entire generations grew up unaware that these individuals, who once shaped the very nation they inhabited, had ever existed. When both sides engage in such practices, the world enters a peculiar reality. There is no longer one objective truth, only competing versions of truth. Each side narrates the story in its own way. Thus, a young American and a young Russian could examine the same event, such as the Vietnam War, and arrive at completely opposite understandings, not because they are lying, but because they were only ever presented with half the story. And here lies the genuine peril. When there are too many conflicting truths, people cease believing in any truth at all. The Cold War, therefore, was not merely a race for nuclear weapons. It was a war that fragmented global memory. Every country was compelled to choose a side, and with that choice, they also selected the version of history they would teach, remember, and transmit. Voices that did not belong to either superpower histories of colonized nations, indigenous peoples, stateless communities were erased from the global memory map. And just like that, the world was made to live under a kind of historical operating system, programmed by two superpowers. You were not permitted to tell your own story without being branded a spy, a traitor, or an instrument of the enemy. When nuclear bombs became too perilous for actual deployment, and direct conflict between the US and the Soviet Union was no longer a viable option, both superpowers recognized a critical insight. Whoever triumphs in culture and ideas captures the world's mind. And so, the CIA entered the arena, not with spies infiltrating enemy lines, but with writers, poets, filmmakers, professors, and magazine editors. This may sound outlandish, but it is precisely what transpired. In one of the most sophisticated operations of the Cold War, known as the Congress for Cultural Freedom, CCF, it presented itself as a noble project on the surface, an independent organization supporting post-war intellectual life in Europe, assisting writers, promoting free expression, and organizing academic conferences. However, behind the scenes, it was entirely funded, planned, and directed by the CIA. They were not composing articles themselves, but they were determining which articles were published, who spoke at conferences, which books reached print, and which authors were lauded as defenders of freedom. You could still write whatever you desired, but if your writing aligned with their desired message, you received support. And what constituted the right message? Anti-communist, pro-Western, celebrating America as the shining beacon of civilization. What was the outcome? An entire ecosystem of cultural content, from Encounter magazine in the UK to Pruvis in France and Tempo Presente in Italy. All were filled with incisive intellectual writing that had already passed through several layers of tacit approval. Writers, poets, critics, and philosophers all appeared independent. Yet, many were subtly guided by indirect influence, not by force, but by funding, not through censorship, but by selecting who was published, who received grants, and who was invited to the next major international symposium. A young writer composes an essay that aligns with the message. They are promoted, translated, given a platform. Write something that does not fit. Sorry, not a good editorial match. What does this imply? It means the entire intellectual landscape after World War II was being reprogrammed, and no one even realized it. You read an essay, you believe it is free thought. You hear a jazz record, you believe it is rebellion. You watch a Hollywood film, you believe it is anti-war. But if you step back, if you piece it all together, you discern the pattern. A story being told softly, brilliantly, and repeatedly. Individualism is good, the West is modern, communism is backward, and America is the heart of logic, progress, and humanity. Do you see it now? This was not crude propaganda like Nazi posters or Soviet murals. This was propaganda veiled as art, and that made it exponentially more effective, because when an idea is conveyed through a beautiful film, a moving song, or a novel that brings you to tears, you will believe it without ever feeling coerced. And that is how the CIA rewrote history, not through textbooks, but through emotion. They did not need to erase the past. They simply needed you to fall in love with a version of the present they had already engineered. Have you ever wondered why some questions never penetrate university curricula? Why certain PhD dissertations are never approved? Why segments of history, even with clear evidence, are still categorized as unfounded, methodologically weak, or simply not academically sound? The answer does not lie in the quality of the research. It lies in who gets to disseminate the truth. The modern academic world, with all its research institutes, peer-reviewed journals, and scholarly committees, is purportedly the arena where the most reliable knowledge is generated. But here is what few people inquire. Who funds it all? And what kind of truth are they paying for? Let us start with a basic reality. Research requires funding. Professors need grants. Universities need financial support. Academic journals need publishers, editorial boards, and impact scores. Naturally, whoever controls the money dictates the direction of knowledge. Did you know that during the post-World War II years, many research projects on politics, history, and society at major American universities were quietly funded by civilian organizations, later revealed to be fronts for the CIA? There was no need to compel anyone to write anything. They did not ban topics. They simply funded the ones they favored. And soon, everyone in the system understood which research would be published and which would not, which topics would secure a job, and which would brand you as controversial. Suppose you are writing about the influence of communism in Africa, and you highlight its positive role in decolonization. Good luck getting published. Suppose you are analyzing the Vietnam War, and you frame America's role not as support, but as invasion. Expect to be told you are biased. But write about the positive effects of Western free markets in post-colonial nations. Suddenly, you are invited to speak. Your paper is cited. Your next grant is approved. Are you beginning to see the pattern? Academia ceased being a place to discover truth. It became a place to filter which truths were acceptable. Over time, the history taught in classrooms stopped being the messy, complex memory of humanity and transformed into a sanitized narrative sponsored by whoever paid the bills. And what about the scholars who did not comply? Many became independent, self-published. But without peer-reviewed journals, without an ISBN, without recognition from the mainstream academic community, they were dismissed as unverified, unprofessional, lacking academic rigor, which truly means the only way to be heard is to speak in a voice the system approves. Every other voice? You do not need to silence it. You simply do not allow it to appear. And so, students across the world still read thick textbooks filled with citations beautifully formatted, profoundly academic, but they never realize what they are reading is a version of history that received funding. Have you ever held a history textbook from any country and assumed it was simply the truth, simplified for students? It is not. It is not merely knowledge. It is a system of curated memory. Textbooks do not emerge out of nowhere. They are the product of committees, political decisions, behind closed doors, meetings about what is appropriate, what reflects national spirit, and what preserves cultural identity. And above all, what avoids controversy. And you understand what that implies, right? When people avoid controversy, they are often simply removing the complex or inconvenient aspects of memory. Take a simple example, the Vietnam War. In the US, students are taught it was an effort to contain communism in Southeast Asia. In Vietnam, it is taught as a heroic resistance against American imperialism. In South Korea, it is framed as part of the global struggle against communism. And in France, it is glossed over, because the colonial occupation of Indochina is not exactly something they wish to highlight. Same war, different story, each one tailored to protect national honor. And when a student grows up with that version, they carry a fixed mold of history in their mind. Later in life, if someone presents a different version, they do not perceive it as merely another perspective. They perceive it as betrayal. Now, apply that same logic to other chapters of history. In Japan, textbooks often downplay or omit the Nanjing Massacre, the comfort women system, and the human experiments carried out during World War II. In China, these are central themes in the curriculum. In South Korea, students learn about the long, painful struggle for dignity under Japanese occupation. In the US, those stories are often skimmed, while the focus shifts to the heroic liberation of Asia by American forces. Or consider the Bengal famine of 1943, where 3 million people in India perished under British colonial rule. In Indian textbooks, it is presented as a direct consequence of British policies. In British textbooks, that event is almost invisible. You see, history is not about the event, it is about who gets to tell it and who edits it. And the most important part, children do not get to choose. They are not shown multiple versions, they are given just one. That version is approved by a ministry, taught by a teacher, tested in exams, and embedded in their minds as truth. But in reality, it is merely state-sponsored memory. And once a memory is programmed from childhood, it becomes the deepest form of belief. No one needs to censor it anymore. The students themselves will defend it as if it were sacred truth. We often repeat the saying, history is written by the victors. And it is true, but only for a while, because eventually the defeated also learn how to tell their stories. At first, they had no printing presses, no publishers, no academic backing, no textbooks. All they possessed were oral memories, smuggled notes, unpublished diaries, or fragments of testimony buried deep in forgotten archives. But then things began to shift. Nations once colonized, after achieving independence, began reclaiming not just their land, but their right to narrate their past. No longer would they solely study the philosophy of Voltaire or the greatness of Anglo-Saxon civilization, but instead, their own stories that had once been scrubbed from textbooks. In India, post-colonial scholars re-examined the British Empire not as a period of infrastructure development, but as a deliberate system of extraction, engineered famines, and cultural disintegration. In Africa, voices like Ngurgir wa Thiong'o chose to write literature, theory, and history in their native languages, refusing to use English or French as a means to reclaim the right to define themselves. In Latin America, historians and activists began to recount the past regarding coups, CIA, interference, and massacres of peasants' events once buried under polite phrases like protecting freedom. Even in Japan and Germany, defeated nations in World War II, brave scholars and thinkers emerged, asking what truly transpired, who were the victims, who was complicit, and who rewrote the past to absolve themselves. And in the United States too, new movements took root. Black history, women's history, LGBTQ+ history, indigenous history, each a powerful endeavor to reclaim voices that had long been silenced. Then came the internet, and the game changed entirely. Individuals outside the traditional system could start a blog, create a podcast, upload a video, publish independently. They did not require approval from an academic board. They did not need the imprimatur of peer-reviewed legitimacy. And audiences began to listen. Of course, not everything online is reliable. Not everyone writes truthfully. But for the first time, history became a contested space. No longer just one version, endlessly repeated in classrooms, news outlets, and lecture halls, but many intersecting narratives clashing, questioning, challenging one another. And that in itself is a gift, because when more people are permitted to tell the story, history ceases to be a monopoly. We begin to perceive what was once erased, who was once silenced, and why they now speak even if it is late, even if it is painful, even if no one ever taught them how to wield a pen. Amidst all the stories of victors and vanquished, of nations vying to rewrite the past, there exists a quiet undercurrent, unaffiliated with any flag, any army, any empire, and yet it has endured longer than most kingdoms. A secret society, without borders, armies, or territory, but with networks deeply rooted in the elite, spanning politics, finance, science, art, and education. They are known as the Freemasons, said to have originated in the Middle Ages, not as rulers, but as builders, stonemasons, architects. However, over time, their work transcended bricks and mortar. They became architects of symbols, of ideas, of memory. They never claimed to hold power. Yet, their fingerprints are on the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the US Constitution, and the ideological revolutions of the 18th century. Many of history's towering figures, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Voltaire, Mozart, were Freemasons. But here is what distinguishes them. They did not write history in textbooks. They encoded it in symbols, in buildings, in rituals, in their redefinition of words like light, knowledge, enlightenment, truth, and freedom. Have you ever noticed the all-seeing eye on the pyramid on the US dollar bill? That is a Masonic symbol, not a coincidence. They believe truth should not be imposed, it should be discovered. And instead of telling you what to believe, they planted symbols in plain sight: schools, courts, theaters, public architecture, and allowed them to whisper. Did they rewrite history? Not in the usual way. They did not erase books, they did not censor records. They constructed an underground layer of history, a parallel stream of knowledge, not public, not mainstream, but influential among those who would later write history for the masses. Consider this. If you were a statesman, a scholar, a lawmaker, and you were raised in the environment of Freemasonry, a place that taught critical thought, ancient symbols, Western mysticism, and personal responsibility to truth, how would you write history? Probably not like everyone else. Some assert that Freemasons were behind revolutions, wars, and global orders. But perhaps the truth is simpler and deeper. They were not pursuing political power. They were redefining the very concept of power itself, power not through coercion, but through shaping how people think. And for centuries, they have achieved this by maintaining a timeless library of symbols, a place where history is not erased, but never fully told, where truth is not on paper, but in how you decode the symbol. Freemasonry never dictates what you must believe, but they create the space for you to doubt everything you have been told. And perhaps that is why, throughout history, those who departed from dogmatic institutions often found refuge in Freemasonry, not to destroy history, but to unlock its hidden layers, those long buried by powers that desired only one version to persist. There are things no one dares to articulate aloud, not due to fear, but because if spoken, no one would believe them. Yet if you carve those things into stone, position them in public view, imbue them with the appearance of mere ornamentation, they will endure for centuries. No one will censor them, no one will object, and eventually, someone will begin to wonder, why is there an Egyptian obelisk over 150 meters tall in the heart of Washington, D.C., known as the Washington Monument? Why does the apex of the pyramid on the US dollar feature an all-seeing eye, and beneath it, the Latin phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages? Why do Gothic cathedrals across Europe adhere to the golden ratio, lay stones with ancient numerical precision, and reiterate the same symbols? The sun, the moon, the six-pointed star. If you begin to pay attention, you will realize that history is not solely written in words. It is concealed in geometry. And the peculiar aspect is that these symbols are never publicly explained. You will not find them in textbooks. There are no tour plaques highlighting them. They simply stand there as if proclaiming, if you understand, you understand. If not, take a selfie and move on. And that is no accident, because symbols are the language of the second layer of knowledge, the layer not intended for the masses, not meant for popularization, a layer where history is not merely a timeline, but a system of codes. Take the obelisk, a stone column ascending towards the sky, first observed in ancient Egypt. It symbolized the connection between heaven and earth, between spirit and cosmos. But why do we find obelisks in Washington, the Vatican, and Paris, precisely at the core of political power? And why do people gather specifically in front of these symbols during major ceremonies? Or the eye in the triangle, called the Eye of Providence. It appears in architecture, currency, paintings, even films. It is often dismissed as the eye of God. But why is it so intimately connected to Freemasonry, to Gnostic texts, to the lighting systems of medieval churches? Then there are sacred mathematics, the golden ratio, 1.618, the Fibonacci sequence, the number 33 inches Freemasonry, the 13 stars and arrows on the dollar bill, the number 7 across Judeo-Christian traditions. These are not coincidences. They are intentional codes repeated through architecture, urban design, scripture, and even state rituals. Do you perceive it now? When history cannot be openly told, some choose to embed it into structures, and structures cannot be censored. No one can erase a monument 100 meters tall. No one dares demolish an ancient wall simply because a strange symbol is carved into it. And so, symbols survive through every regime, every ideology, every rewrite of the textbook. They do not need to be believed, they simply need to exist. And someday, someone will begin to look again, ask questions, and realize that the history we are taught may not be a total lie, but it has omitted everything that has been right in front of us all along. In the past, history was recorded in books, etched into stone, and conveyed by human voices. But now, we are entering a peculiar new era. History is being narrated by algorithms. You open YouTube, TikTok, Google, you type a phrase, Vietnam War, French Revolution, who built the pyramids? What appears is not a definitive line of truth. It is a stream of selections curated not by historians, but by machines. Not what is most accurate, but what is most popular. What garners the most engagement, what compels you to cease scrolling. And that is the age of post-truth history. Whether it is true or not matters less than whether it feels compelling, whether it aligns with your demographic, whether it resonates with things you already favor. The algorithm learns about you, then begins to show you more of what it believes you want. The more you consume a particular viewpoint, the more similar content is presented. Before long, you are inhabiting your own version of history, complete with sources, footage, and expert voices. Yet, it is entirely disconnected from anything that contradicts it. You begin to believe this is the truth. But in reality, the truth has been fragmented, then reassembled to fit your personal feed. In this era, AI is not merely a search tool. It can create history, a fake video, a doctored photograph, an analysis stitched together by machines from millions of sources, even a virtual expert with a perfectly human voice and flawless logic. But no one knows who wrote the script. And if you lack the depth to verify, compare, and challenge, you may believe what you are seeing is history. That is when human memory begins to be reconstructed by machines. No author signs it. No one assumes responsibility. Only a vast system, constantly learning your habits and retelling the past in the smoothest, most palatable way possible. History becomes content, something you scroll through. No longer deep, just fast. No longer debated, just repeated. And when something is repeated frequently enough, it becomes common knowledge not because it is true, but because no one bothers to check anymore. As people began to question everything in a world where trust is eroded and history is reduced to 30-second videos, something unexpected occurred. People started seeking real voices again. Not perfect voices, not those approved by universities, not those impeccably dressed on television, but honest, patient voices unafraid to pose difficult questions. And so, a new generation of storytellers emerged, not from national libraries, but from bedrooms, from microphones connected to laptops, from YouTube channels, Spotify feeds, and Substack newsletters. Voices once dismissed as non-official began to find their own audiences. And the surprising part is, more and more people are listening. From YouTube channels that re-narrate history through a post-colonial lens, to podcasts re-examining the Vatican, Freemasonry, or disappearances in wartime. From independent researchers with no formal degrees but decades of intensive reading and forgotten archives, to freelance journalists reopening cases the mainstream left behind. All of them are weaving a new network of memory. And the most crucial aspect, there is no central censor, no approved version. Each channel represents a voice, and the audience possesses the right to choose, to listen, to question, to debate, or to believe. Of course, not everything is accurate. Not every voice is meticulous with evidence, but precisely because they are free from academic constraints, independent historians are able to address topics the traditional system long avoided, and this has ignited a wave of resistant history, quiet, unofficial, but growing. For example, many first learned about the atrocities of Belgian colonialism in the Congo, not in school, but through an independent video with archival images and subtitles. Many came to understand the murky reality of the liberation of Iraq, not through major newspapers, but through an investigative podcast. Many saw the map of Palestine from 1946 to the present for the first time on TikTok. You see, while the old system founders in skepticism, these new voices, small as they may be, are gaining trust. Not because they are flawless, but because they dare to delve deeply. They dare to articulate the uncomfortable. They dare to admit what they still do not know. And so, a new order of memory is quietly taking shape. No longer a shared history from school textbooks, no longer a national broadcaster recounting the past on your behalf, but millions of people, each with a perspective, a story, a slice of time, and the audience slowly piecing them together into something more dimensional. Yes, it is messy. Yes, there are errors. But perhaps for the first time in a long while, people are relearning how to think critically, how to question, how to seek truth instead of awaiting its delivery. And if there is one reason for hope in this post-truth era of history, it is this. Memory is finding its way back to those who were once denied the right to remember. We grew up believing in a simple idea, that objective truth exists, that what happened, happened, and it cannot be altered, and that history's purpose is to recover that truth. But the deeper you delve, the broader your perspective, and the more fragmented memories you begin to reassemble, you may arrive at a challenging realization. Perhaps historical truth has never existed as a singular, unified entity, because humans do not record events. They record how they comprehend events. And depending on the perspective, you acquire an entirely different version of history. A person shot dead might be remembered as a rebel in a government report, a martyr in the archives of a resistance movement, an unfortunate accident in a military memo, a case under investigation in a newspaper file. All of these may be true or none, depending on who is narrating the story. This is where a controversial yet profound school of thought emerges, postmodernism in historiography. They do not deny that events occurred. They do not claim there is no truth. What they assert is that every truth is a narration, and every narration is shaped by power, language, emotion, and collective memory, not by some omniscient observer. They refer to history as a discourse, a constructed narrative arranged by the storyteller. This implies that there is no pure original, only versions that are accepted and versions that are silenced. You may feel this is dangerous. If there is no objective truth, does that not mean anyone can lie, that everyone is right, and chaos will ensue? But in fact, postmodern thought does not promote chaos. It encourages responsibility in storytelling, because once you understand that no one is neutral in the act of remembering, you become more humble, more careful, more self-critical. They teach us not to ask what is the truth, but instead, who is speaking? Who are they speaking to? By what authority do they speak? And who has been compelled to remain silent? Then history is no longer a straight line. It becomes a multi-dimensional map where every version carries traces of power, intent, and emotion. And our task is not to discover the one perfect version, as school textbooks once dreamed, but to examine all the fragments, listen to many voices, question rigorously, and comprehend that every version is inherently incomplete. Do you see? Now, the danger is not that truth does not exist. The danger is believing there is only one truth, and being compelled to believe it without question. We grow up believing that history is something you learn, but truly, it is something you live with quietly every day. It is in the textbook you read in 4th grade, in the monuments you pass without noticing, in the stories your grandmother recounted, in the videos you watch, the concepts you repeat, never once questioning their origin. And then at some point, you realize you are living within a version of history, a narrative built by someone else, told so many times that it now feels like intrinsic truth. But as we have observed throughout this journey, nothing in history is inherent. Nothing is remembered just because. Everything is a decision. Who gets mentioned? Who is forgotten? Who appears in textbooks? Who survives only in whispers? And here is the hardest truth. If you do not tell your story, someone else will. And they will tell it in a way that serves them. They will label your ancestors savages. They will call your memory folklore. They will characterize your past as something that needed to be civilized. And you will grow up living within a story that is not yours, believing you were fortunate to have been taught it. That is the deepest form of domination. No need for conflict, No need for killing, no need for conquest. Merely rewrite your memory and have you read it as a child. This is why the greatest power does not reside in weapons, or money, or thrones. It lies in the right to tell, the right to write, the right to remember. And that right you can reclaim by questioning what you have always believed, by reading what was once erased, by telling the stories no one deemed important. You do not need to be a historian. You do not need to publish books. You merely need to refuse to allow someone else to define your memory. Because if you do not speak, someone else will speak for you. And if they speak long enough, you might forget you ever possessed a voice of your own. And that is the most terrifying loss. Not war, not genocide, not censorship, but the quiet, willing, permanent forgetting of oneself. Yet if you still remember, if you still wonder, if you still ask, if you still feel the urge to tell, then history is not over. The story is still unfolding. And you still have the right to write. So, if after everything you inquire, who is behind all the rewriting of history, the answer is not a single secret society, not one shadowy figure, but a long chain of people, systems, and motives, always present, transforming across centuries. Some rewrite history because they won and wish to be remembered in their own way. Some control the tools of memory, from scrolls to printing presses, to algorithms, and choose what gets reiterated. And some do not need to do anything at all. They simply benefit when the world remembers incorrectly. No one needs to silence you as long as you believe you already know enough. And once that occurs, you begin to live within a story that feels natural but was never truly yours. So if you ask, who is the invisible hand behind it all? The answer is anyone who can rewrite memory without being questioned. And then you understand that true power does not reside in armies, not in governments, not even in wealth. It lies in who is permitted to speak and who is compelled to forget. And finally, what remains is not an answer, but a deeply personal question. Will you allow others to continue telling your story, or will you begin writing it yourself? Because sometimes, just the act of remembering is sufficient to dismantle the entire architecture of forgetting, and in that moment, history truly begins.